A woman stands at the edge of a collapsed house. The dust is still settling from a sudden, violent wind that swept in from the wilderness. St. Augustine famously called her the devil's assistant. John Calvin labeled her a diabolical fury. Countless sermons have presented her. Stop fighting this agonizing, inevitable end. The battle is lost. Our 10 children are gone. And your body is broken beyond repair. Let the grave have its victory so that your physical torture can finally stop. Say goodbye. This changes the entire architecture of the scene. It transforms her from a flat, one-dimensional villain into a shattered wife begging her husband to accept the end of his suffering. The Hebrew text is intentionally ambiguous, leaving room for the deep, confusing messiness of human grief. She may not be demanding rebellion at all. She may simply be demanding closure. Yet the shadow over her historical reputation remains, largely because of what happens next. If we want to know how her words were truly meant, we cannot only look at a Hebrew dictionary. We have to look at the man sitting in front of her. How did Job understand her words? If she had truly aligned herself with Satan and demanded that he commit the ultimate cosmic sin, we would expect a prophet of his stature to cast her out immediately. We would expect righteous fury and absolute rejection. His response holds the key to her actual condition. It is the defining interaction of their marriage in the midst of total ruin. And, just like her infamous statement, as a weak, fair-weather believer who abandoned her righteous husband the moment his faith was severely tested. His reply is almost always quoted as a harsh, condemning rebuke. But a closer look at the ancient language reveals something far more tender. Job hears his wife's desperate plea. He sits in the dirt, scraping his infected flesh with broken pottery, and offers his famous reply. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil? Job 2:10. For readers eager to villainize her, this is the final piece of evidence. The case is closed. Even Job calls her a fool, confirming her status as a faithless antagonist. But to read this as a harsh, dismissive insult is to project our modern English vocabulary backward onto an ancient, agonizing conversation. Today, calling someone a fool is a personal attack on their intelligence. It is an insult meant to belittle and demean. But the Hebrew word Job uses is Nabal. In the Old Testament, a Nabal is not someone lacking raw intellect or common sense. A Nabal is someone acting in a state of spiritual detachment. It describes a person who has lost their moral or spiritual bearings, acting as if God is absent, unjust, or powerless. It is a description of profound spiritual disorientation. And notice carefully how Job constructs his sentence. He does not say, "You are a foolish woman." He says, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks." Most readers assume she is simply acting as Satan's mouthpiece, an obstacle to be overcome rather than a human being to be pitied. The distinction is not accidental. It is deeply profound. Job is deliberately drawing a line between her fundamental identity and her momentary despair. He knows who she really is. He knows the wisdom she possessed before the sky fell, the faith she held when their family was whole, and the unspeakable trauma she has just absorbed. He hears the breaking of her mind in her words. And he essentially tells her, "This is not you. You are speaking like someone who does not know God. Do not let the grief change who you are." He gently corrects her theology. He reminds her that their relationship with the Almighty cannot be transactional, based solely on receiving blessings. They must also navigate the terrifying mystery of sudden ruin. But while he corrects her conclusion, he does not reject her person. He does not curse her in return. He does not banish her from the ash heap. He does not demand she leave his sight. This is not the response of a righteous man condemning a wicked enemy. It is the response of a broken husband trying to anchor his equally broken wife. He is holding the theological line for both of them when she no longer has the strength to hold it herself. He recognizes that her words are the product of immense pain, not a permanent apostasy. And then, an incredible silence falls over her story. We treat her as a theological test rather than a grieving mother. The familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong to see the danger in her words. After this single, desperate exchange, in Chapter 2, the woman in the ashes vanishes from the dialogue. For the next 39 chapters, she does not speak another recorded word. The narrative immediately shifts into a massive, escalating philosophical debate. 3 of Job's friends arrive from distant lands. They sit in the dust, tear their clothes, and eventually begin delivering long, eloquent, and ultimately wrong speeches about why this suffering must be Job's fault. The theological camera pans away from the grieving mother and focuses entirely on the men arguing in the dirt, because she is no longer speaking. We assume she has left the stage. We assume she stormed off in bitterness, abandoning her husband to face his friends and his God alone. But a closer reading of the text reveals that she never actually left. The book of Job moves into high poetry and divine confrontation. But the woman in the ashes is still sitting quietly in the background. For 39 chapters, the men talk. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar dominate the narrative, filling the air with endless theological theories about suffering, sin, and divine justice. They build elaborate, rigid arguments to explain away the tragedy, because the text focuses entirely on their speeches, but it is tragically incomplete. The problem is not that her statement is shocking. The problem is that we stop reading, pass judgment. We easily assume the grieving mother has packed her remaining belongings and fled. We assume her story ended with her foolish plea. But she did not abandon him. Hidden deep in the middle of Job's agonizing defense, a single verse reveals her ongoing reality. In Job chapter 19, verse 17, A laments, "My breath is offensive to my wife. I am loathsome to my own family." It is a heartbreaking, intensely physical detail. The disease has ravaged his lungs and his gums. The smell of decay is literally on his breath. But notice the spatial reality this implies. To know that his breath is offensive, she cannot be living in a distant town. She must be close enough to smell it. She is still there. She did not walk away when the pain became unbearable. She endured the ashes. She listened to the friends falsely accuse the man she loved of secret, hidden sins. She sat in the dust as the days turned into weeks of unanswered agony. She is the silent survivor of the narrative, holding vigil in the ruins of her family, while the men debate the philosophy of her pain. Finally, the sky darkens. The arguments cease. God speaks from the whirlwind. The Almighty humbles Job with the sheer scale of the cosmos, and fail to consider the physical reality of the woman speaking. We judge her on one sentence, pointing to the foundations of the earth and the creatures of the deep. And then, God turns his attention to Job's friends. His anger burns against Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, because they have not spoken of me what is right. Job 42-7. God demands a massive burnt offering from them and commands Job to pray for their forgiveness. But listen to the silence in the divine verdict. God sharply rebukes the friends for their polished, arrogant theology. He corrects Job for speaking without knowledge. But the Almighty never speaks a single word of condemnation against Job's wife. If her 4 words in chapter 2 were truly the diabolical blasphemy of a faithless villain, why does the judge of the universe completely ignore her offense? Because God does not crush a bleeding woman for crying out in the dark. He knows the difference between a hardened, arrogant rebel and a shattered, traumatized mother. We know she is still standing at the end of the narrative because of how the book closes. In chapter 42, God restores Job's fortunes twofold, and the text notes that Job also had 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. The writer never introduces a second, more righteous wife. Ancient Jewish tradition, early Christian commentators, and the natural reading of the text all point to the same profound reality, completely ignoring a devastating contradiction in how we view the story. She is the only other person in this narrative. It is the exact same woman. She physically carried the restoration of Job. Her womb, which had been emptied by unimaginable grief, became the literal vessel of their future. God did not replace her with a better woman. He honored her. Her survival is a quiet, monumental triumph of grace over despair. We easily celebrate Job's legendary endurance, but we must confront our own rush to condemn hers. And this is where the ancient story suddenly becomes a mirror for our own lives. The silence of God toward Job's wife reveals a profound truth about how heaven handles human pain, but it also exposes a devastating flaw in how we handle each other. We read the book of Job, and we instinctively distance ourselves from his three friends. We think we would never be so cruel as to sit in the dust and lecture a suffering man about his secret faults. Yet, look at how easily history has condemned Job's wife. Look at how quickly we have judged a grieving mother for failing a theological test. In the worst week of her life, we are often much harder on the suffering than God is. This historical rush to judgment exposes our own theology of trauma, and it forces a very uncomfortable question: who matched Job's exact level of emotional loss? When the fire fell from the sky and consumed the sheep, how do you treat the people around you when their world suddenly collapses? When someone you know goes through a shattering loss, a terminal diagnosis, a sudden miscarriage, a ruptured marriage, or a profound psychological struggle, what do you actually require of them? Do you demand that they maintain perfect, polished faith? Do you expect them to speak correctly about God while they are actively bleeding? When someone is sitting in their own ashes and says something angry, cynical, or completely despairing, do you immediately correct their doctrine, or do you recognize the unmistakable sound of a breaking mind? Job's friends demanded theological precision from a man in agony. They wanted everything to fit into a neat, predictable system. But Job looked at his wife, heard her desperate plea for his suffering to end, and recognized her words for what they were. He did not agree with her conclusion, but he refused to abandon her in her despair. He held on to her when she could no longer hold on to anything. We must learn to offer the grace Job offered his wife. This does not mean we excuse cruelty, and it does not mean we allow trauma to justify abuse. But it does mean we stop treating a fractured cry of pain as a permanent spiritual failure. We must stop demanding perfect theology from traumatized people. Perhaps you are the one sitting in the ashes right now. It was her livelihood burning. When the Chaldean raiders stole the camels and slaughtered the servants, those were her servants. You may feel like your faith has completely collapsed under the weight of a prolonged, unanswered sorrow. You may have spoken words in the dark words of anger, doubt, or deep resentment toward heaven that you now feel ashamed of. You may assume that your spiritual struggle in the crisis has disqualified you from grace. If that is you, look closely at the woman in this ancient text. God is not threatened by the messy, unpolished, and even angry prayers of a shattered heart. He does not destroy us for what we cry out when the pain becomes unbearable. The Almighty can handle the fractured theology of a grieving mother. Your spiritual standing is not measured by the perfection of your vocabulary when the pressure is crushing you. The fact that she survived her grief without being struck down by divine judgment is a testament to the immense, patient mercy of God. He gave her the space to survive the darkness without demanding that she explain herself. And this is where we must look at the complete architecture of her life. There is one final image that brings her entire, misunderstood journey together. Because the story begins in the ashes. But it does not end there. Step back and look at the complete architecture of this unnamed woman's life. When we zoom out from that single verse in chapter 2, and when the house fell on the feasting family, they were not just Job's children. They were her children. The rigid, cruel caricature we have painted of her completely dissolves. Instead of a one-dimensional villain of faithlessness, we see a profound portrait of human reality. Her story is defined by three monumental realities: a shared grief so heavy it fractured her mind, an ambiguous, desperate cry born from watching the man she loved suffer, and a silent, stubborn endurance that outlasted all the arrogant debates of men. She absorbed the collapse of her wealth, the death of her 10 children, and the physical decay of her husband. Yet she never actually walked away. To understand the magnitude of her survival, we must return to the opening image. Think back to the woman standing at the edge of the collapsed house. Remember the heavy dust in the air, and the agonizing walk to the ash heap outside the city gates. For centuries, religious history has forced her to stay in that dirt. We have trapped her in the ashes of her lowest moment, defining her entire existence by a few words spoken in the delirium of acute trauma. But the ashes do not remain. Turn the page to the end of the book, and the ash heap outside the city is gone. The rotting flesh is healed. The wind that destroyed everything has finally settled. In place of the ruins, there is a new house, and inside that house, there is a new, full table. Imagine the woman sitting at that table. She is older now. Beneath the heavy stone, shattered timber, and crushed limestone are the bodies of her 7 sons and 3 daughters. 10 children. She had carried them. She had birthed them. She had nursed them, raised them, and loved them. Her face carries the deep, permanent lines of a mother who has buried 10 children. Those specific scars will never completely disappear, because the new children do not erase the memory of the first. But the terrible, suffocating silence of her grief has been broken. She is holding a new son. She is watching new daughters grow up. She is sharing a meal with the husband she once begged to let go. God did not replace her with a stronger, more perfect believer. The Almighty honored her silent endurance. He allowed the woman whose womb had been violently emptied to become the literal vessel of the Great Restoration. She carried the future in her own body. This is not ultimately a story about a rebellious, wicked wife who failed a divine test. It is a story about the crushing, unspeakable weight of shared loss, and the quiet, enduring grace that allows a broken person to eventually breathe again. If you are walking through your own season of ruin, let her true story change your perspective. When your world collapses, you do not need pristine theology. You do not need to say the perfect words to prove your faith. You simply need to hold on. The pressure is not exposing your wickedness. It is only revealing your humanity. God is not offended by your grief. He is standing with you in the dust, waiting for the day when the ruins can be cleared away. This is not ultimately a story about a rebellious, wicked wife. It is a story about the crushing weight of shared, unspeakable loss. The God of Job does not demand that we never break. He simply asks us to trust that the breaking is not the final chapter. We thought she was the villain of the story. She is actually a monument to survival. The woman who begged for death became the mother of a new beginning. If this kind of careful study helps you see Scripture more clearly and gives you hope in the hard seasons, consider subscribing to the channel. Share this video with someone who feels trapped in their own ashes. And leave a comment below about what this story means to you. The question is not merely whether her theology failed in a moment of darkness. The deeper question is why we demand perfect theology from a woman standing over 10 fresh graves. Why did the woman who lost everything give what is widely considered the worst advice in the Bible? And what if we have completely misunderstood what she was actually trying to do? She steps into those ashes outside the city gate, not as a detached observer, but as a profoundly traumatized mother. The ashes were the place of refuse, the place where the city cast out its waste, its broken things, and its diseased outcasts. By walking into the dirt beside him, she has left behind the comforts of her former status. She is sitting in the dust of her ruined life. Her body and mind are in a state of acute, violent shock. The ancient world had no vocabulary for this kind of psychological trauma, but the physical reality of her grief would have been undeniable. To understand how she reached her breaking point, her entire future, wiped out in a single afternoon. The silence that follows a disaster of this magnitude is heavy, and what her infamous words actually meant. We cannot simply study her theology. We have to look at what she was actually carrying to the ash heap. In the ancient Near East, a woman's identity and security were bound entirely to 2 realities: the prominence of her household and the lives of her children. when both were suddenly erased, she effectively ceased to exist. Job is described in the opening verses as the greatest man among all the people of the East. This means his wife was a matriarch of immense influence. She managed a massive estate, oversaw countless servants, and hosted feasts for a large, thriving family. In her cultural world, 10 children, 7 sons, and 3 daughters were the ultimate evidence of divine favor. They were her legacy, her joy, and her absolute protection for the future. Then came the day the messengers arrived, one after another, breathless and covered in dust. They delivered the news. The oxen and donkeys stolen, the sheep burned, the camels raided, the servants slaughtered. The loss of wealth meant sudden, terrifying vulnerability. But it was the final messenger who delivered the fatal blow. The house had fallen. Every single one of her children was dead. We often read the first chapter of Job as a rapid, mechanical sequence of events. We scan the verses quickly. It is the physical absence of laughter, of motion, of life. It is the sound of a world ending, to reach the philosophical debate. But in human time, trauma moves with an agonizing, suffocating slowness. Imagine the days that followed. Imagine the silence of a sprawling estate that once echoed with the voices of a massive family. Imagine the physical weight of burying 10 children in the span of a single week. The ancient world had strict, visceral mourning rituals, wailing, tearing garments, wearing sackcloth. But no ritual is large enough to contain the emptying of a mother's womb 10 times over. She is not a theological debating partner stepping in from a comfortable parlor. She is a co-sufferer whose own heart has been torn completely open. Yet, the tragedy does not stop at the grave. The story escalates. Satan strikes Job with a horrific physical illness, malignant sores covering his entire body. The affliction is so repulsive, the stench of decay so strong, that Job is forced outside the city to the ash heap. The local quarantine for the diseased and the dying. This creates a new, terrifying layer of trauma for his wife. She has lost her children, her wealth, and her social standing. Now, she is losing her husband. She must watch the man she loves scrape his infected skin with broken pottery. She turns away from the rubble and walks out beyond the city gates to the local dump, the ash heap. There, she finds her husband. She must listen to his groans in the dark. Anyone who has sat beside a hospital bed, watching a spouse suffer in intractable, incurable pain, knows the unique torture of this position. There is a specific kind of helplessness that comes from watching someone you love disintegrate, knowing you cannot stop the pain. Job's suffering is direct and physical. Her suffering is collateral and psychological. She is entirely alone, standing on the edge of the ashes, trapped between the graves of her children and the rotting body of her husband. She has reached the absolute limit of human endurance. The pressure has exposed a fracture that no mind could be expected to hide. What happens when shared grief turns into complete isolation? When the pain of watching someone suffer eclipses the desire to keep them alive? It is out of this unimaginable darkness, looking down at a man who is actively wishing he had never been born, that she finally breaks the silence. And it is here that we must look closely at what she actually says. She steps closer to the ashes. The smell of infection is overwhelming. The sound of broken pottery scraping across ruined skin fills the heavy silence. He is covered in painful, weeping boils from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. She looks down at her husband and speaks just a few short words. In most English translations, the sentence hits like a hammer. Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. For centuries, readers have projected a specific voice onto this verse. We imagine a sneer. We hear malice, sarcasm, and bitterness. We picture a woman standing with her hands on her hips, mocking a righteous man for his foolish devotion. We assume she has turned against him, demanding that he throw away his faith in exchange for a quick judgment. but humanize the scene. Filter those same words through the vocal cords of a mother who has just buried 10 children in deep grief. Filter them through the exhaustion of a wife who has spent days watching the man she loves groan in incurable, pointless agony daily. The word used for integrity implies completeness, innocence, and moral order. She is looking at a completely shattered world where frameworks collapse. She sees her husband desperately clinging to the idea that his righteousness will save him, even as his flesh rots away entirely. She is not mocking his faith. She is grieving his denial. The catastrophe is absolute. There is no coming back from this point. And then comes the second half of her statement, "Curse God and die," framed by most commentators as a direct attack on heaven. Scraping his ruined skin with a piece of broken pottery, she looks at the man she loves. Psychologically, it operates as an act of desperate, misplaced mercy. Anyone who has kept vigil beside a hospice bed understands this breaking point. Listening to the labored breathing of someone they deeply love. There comes a moment when the pain of the sufferer becomes unbearable. The family stops praying for recovery and starts praying for release. Job is covered in malignant, weeping sores, and every breath is agony. His wife wants the torture to end. In their ancient theological understanding, directly blaspheming the Almighty was considered a major capital offense. It was a crime that would surely bring immediate, fatal divine judgment. If God will not heal him, she reasons, God might strike him. She is effectively telling him to trigger his own execution, to simply let go. Job himself will spend an entire chapter wishing death. He will curse the day he was born and beg for the grave to swallow him up entirely in his deep sorrow. His wife is simply the first one to vocalize the tragic reality that death is now the only logical escape from this suffering. She is speaking the quiet, agonizing truth of a terminal room. This is not a rebellion born of sudden hatred or anger. It is a surrender born of total exhaustion. She cannot watch him suffer one more day in such terrible physical pain, looks at the ashes of their life, and speaks the only 4 words history will ever remember her for: curse God and die. Yet, we construct entire sermons condemning her for this outburst. We use her as the ultimate example of how not to handle suffering. We lock her identity forever to the English word curse. But the English translation hides a startling reality about the text. Our condemnation rests on a word she may never have intended. To understand what she actually asked, we bypass English translators and return to the ancient world. If you unroll the original scroll and trace the Hebrew letters, the word changes completely. The word curse does not just change its nuance. It disappears entirely from the original Hebrew text of the ancient passage. When you open the Hebrew text of Job, chapter 2, the word the grieving mother speaks is barak. It is one of the most common and beautiful theological words in the entire Old Testament. It literally means to kneel, to praise, or to bless. It is the exact same word used when a patriarch blesses his sons before his death, or when a psalmist blesses the Lord in the sanctuary. The literal translation of her sentence is not an insult at all. She tells him, "Bless God and die." So, why do almost all modern English Bibles translate this beautiful word as curse? The answer lies in ancient literary tradition. For thousands of years, she has been preached as a villain. She is the ultimate cautionary tale of a faithless, bitter spouse. Many scholars and translators argue that the author of Job is using a euphemism because the very idea of explicitly cursing the Almighty was considered so horrific to the ancient mind. Scribes sometimes substituted the word bless to avoid writing a direct blasphemy onto a sacred scroll. The translators assume her tone is deeply sarcastic. They look at her terrible circumstances, look at her husband's pain, and assume her heart has turned entirely black. They decide that she must mean the exact opposite of the word she actually used. They flatten her profound, complex grief into simple, bitter rebellion. But that translation choice assumes her guilt before the evidence is fully weighed. What if we refuse to assume her malice? What if we read the word exactly as she spoke it? In the ancient Near Eastern world, the word barak carried another practical nuance. It was not just used for religious praise. It was the word spoken at a departure. It meant to say, farewell. When someone was leaving on a long journey, you would barak them. You would give a parting blessing. Read through this linguistic lens. The woman standing in the ashes is not shouting, a blasphemous, demonic command. She is weeping, a final plea. Bless God and die. Say your farewell to heaven. Make your peace with the Almighty, and let your spirit go.